Welcome back to Prime Your Midlife. April 2023 was Stress Awareness Month, one of the silent killers for many families, organizations, and individuals. And Paddy MacBrant over here, has done a whole series of interviews with different leaders of industry to talk about this subject of stress. So I invited him today to talk to us about some of the key observations that he's picked up from talking insightfully about stress. Paddy, welcome to the screen today. How are you, sir?
Good, thank you, Chris. How's things?
Well, honestly, things are good today, but thank you for asking. And isn't it peculiar, just that question, as to how many people superficially sort of paper over the answer? How are you today, Paddy?
Oh, yeah, fine. Yeah. No, you're totally right. You're totally right. I tend to ask when I work with people. I tend to ask them for a scale of 1 to 10. And one of the things we teach, just diving straight in there, one of the things we teach around mental health, first aid, and things like that, and coaching and things like that, is that we don't ask open-ended questions. We ask lots of open-ended questions, but when we ask things like that, we need a scale of reference. So what we tend to say is, oh, instead of how are you feeling, because someone could say meh, or they say I'm feeling a bit blue or whatever, and that means nothing. It means nothing to anyone. You say, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being and 10 being greatest day of your life, where are you?
Well, we're going straight into the lessons and learnings here. And my other thought on that is, don't ask the question unless you're willing to assist with the response. Because when somebody says, actually, I'm a 2, and you go, oh, well, that's good. Thanks for telling me that. And you've not actually paid any time to the response, then that's also a very, very bad emotional outcome for both.
Yeah, totally. And you can use it as a good way of really, if we kind of get into sort of mindfulness and things like that, and I guess also journaling and that kind of awareness of your feelings, you can sort of say, if somebody says to you, oh, I'm a 7, you go, oh, great, 7's good, better than half. Why have you lost 3 points? Where are those other 3 points gone? Why aren't you an 8 or a 9? And they go, oh, well, this, that, the other. And sometimes it's just a case of, actually, I'm just having a bad day. But then the other side to it is I work with quite a lot of young people to help with their kind of anxiety and stress and things like that. And, we go through this process and we'll see each other multiple times a week or multiple times a month or whatever. And we'll say, oh, so on the scale of 1 to 10, where are you? And it's really useful to remember their previous answer. And they say, oh, I'm a 6. And you go, that's fantastic. Last time we saw each other, you were a 4. Brilliant. It's getting better, because people, and young people particularly, but people tend to get in this kind of spiral motion. They kind of feel like this is it. When it's bad, this is it. And so when you kind of point out to them, actually, your scale went like this, and look, we're on an upward trajectory. Let's carry that momentum. Let's keep going. When you get that moment from them, they kind of go, oh, you're right, it is getting better. And that in itself is a lift for a lot of people.
There's so much validity in that for me, for example, I am naturally more of a glass half full kind of person. So somebody would ask me and I wouldn't generally be an 8, a 9, or sometimes even a 10. So for me, a 7 is actually pretty awful. But from your perspective, a 7 might be, well, that's conditionally a norm from a response perspective. So that linear tracking of what did Chris say last time and how is he against his norm line, there's so much importance on that. Let's just unpack, just for the benefit of the audience. Paddy, could you try to distill in a couple of short sentences? I know you'd quite like to play with time. What is it you think you do for people that meet you from a professional capacity?
So I see my role in the world as being someone that helps understanding. I have experienced mental health challenges for my entire life. Actually, I don't remember a point in my life where I didn't experience these challenges. And so my role and what I do for people is to show them that these things do exist and that they're not the end of the world and that they're not unusual and they're not weird and they're not scary and then, you know, and they're all not all of these things that we generally have this feeling about. My job is to kind of go, okay, you're a 7. Let's get you to an 8. You know, it's fine that you're a 7. It's not a problem that you're a 7. But what do we do to get you to an 8? And primarily I do that with most of the people I meet. You know, generally speaking, most of the people I meet get the benefit, whether they want it or not, get the benefit of that kind of perspective. But generally speaking, I do that mostly within the industry in which I'm an expert, which is logistics. I've worked in logistics for a good few years now, and primarily it's a very male dominated industry. You know, the average age of a trucker is something like 48 or something. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's mid to late 40s and very much midlife, and it's a very specific kind of person that ends up working in that industry. And so that's where and it's also that kind of person, generally speaking, rubbish at talking about their feelings, rubbish at it. And so that's where I find I make the most impact.
Well, I was looking on your website before we obviously started, and there's this very, very stark statistic on there associated with the preponderance of suicides actually in your industry. And perhaps you could just help the audience understand the significance of that statistic.
Yeah. So the kind of story behind the statistic is we were looking to find a way to really distill the point. We were looking to find a way to really show people what was going on within the industry. And we took the Office for National Statistics you have loads of data available. If anyone's ever looking for data, the Office for National Statistics, it's free to use. Just go and get it. You can ask them for specific things and they will send you spreadsheets of it. And we asked them over the past 10 years, well, over the 10 years of best data, so for them it was 2011 to 2020, for suicides by occupation. And we found there was something like 15,000 suicides in a 5-year period. So it's a pretty shocking statistic. And generally speaking, we talk about a suicide every 90 minutes. There's about 16 suicides in England and Wales. There are about 16 suicides per day. And when we actually went through and we pulled out everyone who we would classify as working in logistics, so that's warehousing, that's transport, that's any kind of management, that's directors, that's mechanics, there's all sorts of people involved in the industry. There were 1,572, I think it was, of those 15,000 suicides were people working in logistics, which statistically tells us every year 1 in 10 suicides from people in work was somebody working in logistics. It's a shocking statistic, given that when we look at sort of actually how many, and you kind of go, okay, well, fair enough, maybe 1 in 10 people work in logistics. And that's just not the case. And we found that actually, when we boiled down to it, it's about 3.5% of the UK population, or the population of England and Wales, work in logistics. There's a good few million people in that industry. 7% of suicides are people from logistics. So we have double the rate of other industries. Now that kind of really shocked us. And when we looked further, we sort of went, actually, well, maybe this is just a thing. Maybe if we look at a different industry like healthcare, for example, we look at doctors and nurses, notoriously a very high rate of suicide, very high rate of mental health challenges in those industries, just because of the type of work that they do, the type of trauma they experience. And actually, we found that the rate in logistics was double. It was twice as high as that of in nursing, for example, which, you know, and then you kind of go, okay, well, maybe it's just the fact that it's men. Men, statistically, 3 out of every 4 suicides, men. 3/4 of all suicides are men. So maybe that's the reason. Now, 90% or 90 something percent of people in logistics are men, but a higher rate of suicides. It's something like, I can't remember exactly what it is, but I think statistically it was something like 11% of men, of normal men, of the general public, experience suicidal thoughts at some point. But within logistics, it's something like 15%. So even there, it's a higher rate. So there's something about the industry that is causing these problems. It could well be that the industry attracts people who are particularly susceptible to these things, or it could be that the industry itself causes people to be susceptible to these things, or a weird combination of the two. But there's something about the work that we do in logistics, there's something about logistics as a thing that causes people to have these challenges.
Well, thank you for those stark observations. And obviously, if you're a listener today and you're not in logistics, I know unequivocally that what Paddy's going to talk to us about is going to be beneficial, whether or not you are sitting behind the wheel of a Lamborghini or a Lotus or a Skoda or a big truck, or just going about your daily business. So I want to applaud you for this concept of bringing Stress Awareness Month to lots of people through the medium of both voice, video, and LinkedIn. Where did this thought process come from, Paddy? Why did you do it?
When I was I've been working for a logistics consultancy called Hatmill for a few years now, and when I was there, I started something we call the Funployee Trust. So essentially just a bit of fun for everyone involved, and the idea was we would just, because we were in the depths of lockdown, everyone was miserable, we couldn't get on site, things like that. So we were just trying to, I was just trying to sort of make the day a bit better for everyone. And during that, someone had the idea, why don't we start an internal podcast and we'll start talking about these things? And so I did. I started a podcast and we started talking to people. And the questions I asked were things like, how did you start with the company? What was your kind of journey into logistics in the first place? But then we also asked, what are you proud of? What are you scared of? What irritates you? What frustrates you? And so I started talking to people about this sort of thing, and it was incredible. And I was talking to some of my colleagues in the business, and they were saying, I look like I've got everything together, I look like I'm totally confident in everything, but I'm absolutely terrified all the time. Every time I get a phone call from a client, I'm scared that it's them going to tell us off, or I'm scared that we're going to lose something. I was like, oh my God, I had no idea. You always seem like you've got all of your shit together, and you don't. And then when we released these podcasts into the business, it became very much and I think, Chris, when you and I talked about this, when I interviewed you for the podcast, for the external one, it became hang on, you feel that? I feel, oh my God. And so when I get it, it's like this, and when I get it, it's like this, and oh well, I've tried this, and this idea works for me, and it became this really nice moment that actually we all started talking about these things, and it became really, really beneficial. So I was in a position where actually one of the challenges I find, and again, Chris, I dare say you've experienced this, is people are rubbish at talking about their feelings. They're just rubbish at it, because for a number of reasons. One of them is stigma. One of them is this idea that actually I'm weird for feeling like this. I'm wrong. I'm broken in some respect. And so the idea was that actually, if I can get people to talk about this stuff, really openly talk about it and say, actually, do you know what? This is something I do and I hate it. This is something I really struggle with. This is something I find stressful. This is whatever. That then more of us would talk about it. We find that, and some of this, again, it comes back to some of the statistics we know. We know that, for example, 3 in 4 suicides are men. However, 3 in 4 mental health diagnoses are women. Now, either men are totally fine for a considerable period of time and then they're not, or women are getting a diagnosis and then getting the help that they need. And there was another statistic that said something on the lines of the proportion of men, once they've received a diagnosis, who would then go and actually seek out help. Because yes, you can be diagnosed with anxiety or depression or PTSD or whatever, but actually if you don't go and get help, the diagnosis isn't really worth very much. Men who would go and seek the help men who wouldn't go and get help far outstripped any number of men who would go and get help. And so the idea of this whole process was actually to reduce that stigma, make people realize actually it's okay. I'm not weird for feeling like this. I'm not weird that these problems exist. And I found, like, during my working life, when I worked as, for example, as a transport planner, when you've got that kind of openness with your team. So as a transport planner, I was responsible for organizing the workloads and organizing the time of 10, 20, 30, depends on the job, but up to 50 drivers at a time. You know, and when you start talking to them and saying, actually, do you know what, I'm having a really rubbish day because I'm feeling like this, that, the other, suddenly they want to talk to you about their day as well. Mm. I just wanted to be able to replicate that kind of feeling again and again and again and again, so people recognize, actually, I'm not weird. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not broken in some respect. It's just part of being a human being.
Well, we'll talk about the outputs in just a second. The thing that struck me about what you said there is that we are rubbish at talking about our mental health, but transversely, it's also the people that hear that message are perhaps not conditioned or well-trained or willing to be the listener of the person that wants to download the message. And therefore we don't want to talk about it, because when we did have a go, it was an unmitigated failure for us. Is that fair?
Oh, totally. Totally. It's one of the things we find with businesses all the time when they train their mental health first aiders is they go ahead and they pick Jeff because Jeff's the physical first aider. But Jeff's the physical first aider because Jeff happened to be in the office 5 years ago when they came around saying, who wants to do first aid? Fact is, Jeff's got no interest whatsoever in being a physical first aider, and he's sure as heck got no interest whatsoever in being a mental health first aider. But damn it, he even gets a day off work to be able to go and do the course. Right. Yeah. And we find it's very common, really common.
You put this program together of a series of structured interviews with a number of stakeholders in your industry.
Yeah.
And the focus was specifically on stress. It's a basic question, but what is the correlation between stress and then all those statistics you gave us about end of life?
So stress is what we could kind of consider as being a gateway illness, if you like. Every single mental health challenge that exists is worsened or caused by stress. All of them, without exception. And when we kind of talk about stress, it's kind of important to recognize that actually it's our body's kind of reaction to pressure. And evolutionarily, it's got a really important part, but actually nowadays, not so much. And so what we find is that people who are under a lot of stress are much more likely to develop depression, for example, or anxiety. People who, post-traumatic stress disorder is caused by a traumatic incident, and it causes stress, which then, a lot of people who develop a mental health challenge, sorry, that's not correct. A lot of the suicides are a result of someone who has developed a mental health problem. And so actually it's a little bit like trying to deal with a challenge early on. It's trying to deal with an injury early on. It's a heck of a lot easier to put a plaster over your finger when you've got a cut. It becomes harder when the cut becomes infected. It becomes harder still when the finger becomes gangrenous, and so on and so forth. And suddenly actually what started out as just go wash your hand and put a plaster on it becomes, okay, you now need quite some serious surgery, and you may have developed some form of sepsis. So actually, if we can kind of deal with stress, it's this much of a problem compared to this much of a problem.
During all the conversations then, could you try to give us some highlights of how prevalent this subject of stress is from the conversations you had?
Yeah, so I spoke to 11 different people from across the industry. There were some drivers, there were some mechanics, there was some sales team, there was some management, so on and so forth. There was a lot of different people involved in there, and there was some really senior people and some really quite junior people in their businesses. And the common theme was that they all experienced this. All of them experienced this. And this may well be statistically because they agreed to be on a podcast about stress, you know, but they all experienced it. And all of them talked about not recognizing it at the time. They all talked about feeling like they just didn't recognize the warning signs when they were happening. But then later on in hindsight, it was very clear. So I remember one of the people we talked to, Steve, who was a project manager for automation projects, talked about getting ill, finding that he was becoming ill with his stress, and actually didn't recognize that until much, much later on, you know. And we're talking to people like Claire, who is the head of a trade body, talking about how her stress at the time was very much related to some of the redundancies she was having to put through when she was in charge of a site, and how actually that was really, really challenging for her, really, really difficult for her. But she didn't feel like she had anywhere to go. She didn't feel like she felt alone in that moment. So that was really quite shocking for me, actually, with the number of people who didn't recognize that it was happening. Because again, from the outside looking in, you see it happening, and from other people you see it happening. But also the idea that when they did recognize it was happening, these people felt alone. And that's really challenging. That's a really difficult problem for someone to experience.
And what are the kind of warning signals then that retrospectively they saw but ignored? Or if we are observing other people in the workplace, what are the warning signals that we could be mindful of to say, hey, by the way, how many out of 10 are you today? Because you're just seeing a change in behavior. So maybe you can answer that for us. What should we be aware of ourselves? And then second part of the question, what could we be looking out for to assist others?
Yeah. So you nailed it there when you said a change in behavior. What we're looking for is somebody who is not behaving the way they normally would. So think about that in terms of yourself. Now, I haven't got it with me because it's packed away in a box somewhere, but a really useful exercise that you can do, and I encourage other people to do this because it's a great exercise in mindfulness and self-awareness, is take a piece of paper and split it down the middle. And on one side of the piece of paper say, this is, never know which way around to go, this is a sign of that I'm mentally healthy. But, and then on another piece of paper, this is a sign that I'm mentally unhealthy. But, and what you do is you go through and you will spot the warning signs for yourself. So for example, for me, when I'm feeling great and I'm happy and I'm good, I make loads of jokes. I'm constantly making stupid, essentially dad jokes. But I know, and so sign that I'm mentally healthy, I'm making stupid jokes, you know. But I know I don't have to. It's not a sign. If I don't want to make a joke, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm having a problem. You know, for another one, I sing in the car. I'll put my music on really, really loud and I will sing in the car. But again, sometimes I've got a sore throat. I don't want to sing in the car. And so when you go down these lists and you kind of go through all these things, I like going out for a run, or I like walking the dog, I like cooking, whatever. all the things that you do when you're feeling really, really good, when you're in a proper flow state. Spot that and go, actually, I haven't wanted to do that for a few days. There might be something wrong. Other things, so we are looking for, generally speaking, are you getting more irritable with people? Do you find yourself just getting annoyed at things? Do you find that you're forgetting things? You can't really sit still? Do you sort of twitch and jiggle about? That's a good sign. Not a good sign, but it's an interesting one to look out for. And the one that people forget about, and always, whenever I teach, it makes people giggle because they go, how am I supposed to spot that in my colleagues? Is your libido drops or it changes. People become really, really horny, or they completely become a prude. One or the other. And it's whatever's the opposite of your norm. And when that happens and you go, actually, do you know what? You can sit next to your partner and you go, we haven't had sex in days or weeks or months or whatever. Why? You know, and so, like I said, it's a very much a case of watch out for a change. Are you just not feeling yourself? Because if you're just not feeling yourself, there's probably a reason. And stress is one of those things that can be caused internally or externally. It can be as a result of, actually, you know, I've got a sore stomach and so I'm just not feeling myself, and that's kind of a bit stressful. Or it can be a case of, I've got a big presentation at work, or I've got an exam to do, or, you know, something like that. It can be, I'm moving house. It could be my relationship has got problems. It can be all sorts of things that cause these things. But when you are not feeling like yourself, that's the thing to watch out for.
And from the conversations you had, could you give us any clear examples of stress coping cultures that has enabled stress to become more of a freely enabling conversation for employees?
Yeah, I mean, stress is one of those difficult ones, because people sort of, when you start talking about it at work, sometimes businesses get worried because, you know, it's a really difficult thing to solve without it very much takes a culture shift to solve a chronic stress issue. And some of the best ones I've seen are where businesses have just stripped away this kind of formality and this office politics. You know, one of the businesses I work with, they have this focus on feedback. So if, for example, you and I are working together and I think you've done something bad, I say, actually, Chris, do you mind if I give you some feedback? I said, and then there's a really structured way in which they do it. And they say, you know, look, Chris, when you asked me that question, the tone of your voice made it sound like you were, you know, when you asked me that question, the tone of your voice made it sound like you were a bit annoyed. And because of that, it's kind of made me feel a bit on edge. Are you annoyed with me? And then if you say, actually, no, I'm not annoyed with you, okay, well, fair enough. Maybe I think because of the way that has sort of changed the atmosphere in the room, maybe in future you should think about how you speak to other people. And I think that will make a really big difference. Is that okay? And then the correct response to that is, oh, thank you for my feedback, or I'm sorry, I don't understand. Could you explain it better? And because everyone can give that feedback, you know, the lowest member of the team can give that to the CEO of the business, and that's acceptable. And the CEO leads by example, and he really pushes that message forward. Means that actually, from top to bottom, everybody's happy. There is no niggling thing, because actually, when there's a niggling thing and someone is sort of complaining about someone behind their back, you go, actually, can I give you some feedback? Chris, the way that you're kind of talking about Steve or whatever, really, I think you need to go and talk to Steve about this, because actually, because you're complaining to me, it means that you're actually eroding the trust in the room, because I don't feel like I can tell you things now. Is that okay? And then you go, oh, okay, fair enough. Oh, you're right. You know, I do need to go and talk to Steve, because at the moment, Steve's got no idea he's doing anything wrong. Mm-hmm. And when Steve doesn't have any idea he's doing anything wrong, he's just going to keep doing it. and you're going to keep getting annoyed with him. And it just erodes relationships.
Yeah.
And it's a really important focus in all of that.
And stress, we're talking about it in a very negative way today, but actually, I do think that there is a part for stress to play to try to make us perform at our best. I know if you're going on holiday, for example, there's so much stress associated with the journey and the packing, but actually, it almost makes me perform at a hugely productive way because I slay off the things that aren't important and focus on the things that are pivotal to going away on holiday stress-free. So can you give us a bit of a contentious view on how stress could sometimes empower us to be better?
I'm glad you asked, because it's one of those things that we always forget about. When you think about stress, there's a really interesting model to think about stress with, and it's called Yerkes-Dodson.
How do you spell that? Sorry, just
can I spell it? Why?
You're under stress now. You're right.
Yeah. Yerkes-Dodson. Two separate words. And essentially, the other name for it is the Goldilocks curve, because stress is a too much, too little, just right situation. And everyone's different. And this is what I mean when we start this whole conversation talking about a clear scale. Everyone's different, because too much stress to me might be perfect for you, and vice versa. And the idea basically is, and when you look at the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and it's a curve like that, and it's basically amount of stress along the bottom and the productivity on the side, and you can sort of put that in different places, but basically down here right at the bottom where you've got low stress, no one's productive because they're bored. They're bored and they're fed up, and boredom drives stress, drives anxiety, drives depression. Right, that's just one of those things. Boredom drives depression. It's just one of those things, for too long anyway. Then you go through this phase of, oh, great amount of pressure. Really, I'm feeling really engaged and enthusiastic, and it's perfect. And I've got deadlines to meet, but it's, that is great. And that just drives this really nice feeling of, yeah, we're in a good place and got loads to do and really being productive. It's a bit like you said, people experience this sort of stuff when they're kind of training for something, or they're getting ready for something they enjoy. That's really good. And that's adrenaline. That's really good stuff. And then we tip over that into fatigue and burnout. Too much stress for too long means fatigue, it means burnout, it means problems, and it means illness. Physical illness comes from burnout, which again, in and of itself, stressful. And that basically means too much stress for too long, problem. So you really want to be in this nice little central column of good amount of stress. And unfortunately, good amount of stress changes day by day. And so what might feel great on Monday feels awful on Tuesday. And so it's, do you know what, Chris, you described it as a contentious issue. It's not. It's pure fact. Stress is Goldilocks. Good, too little, just right, too much. I don't know if I've done that the right way around in terms of we talk about timelines, but it's true. Too little, just right, too much. And you have to be really consciously aware of what is just right. And when you go back and you think about what we talked about earlier in terms of actually normally when I'm feeling great, this is what I do, this is what I do, this one. And when I feel bad, this is what I do, this is what I do, this is what I do. You can kind of identify those things, figure out what's causing it, and then go, actually, is that because I've not got enough or I've got far too much? And when you figure that out, you can drive yourself straight back into the middle again.
What I liked about your methodology of this non-healthy and healthy traits that you could see is that there's a huge amount of self-accountability and self-awareness on that. And one of my measures is to sometimes say, by doing this, I'm going to have to face the fact that there are going to be consequences, and I'm going to have to let some things go, because I cannot physically make this my primary objective and also continue to meet all these obligations over here. Which one of these over here am I going to happily wane, let go, or not be as good as it was for the ulterior motive, which is to make sure that that primary objective is going to be nailed on. Other than that lovely way of sitting down with yourself and having that perspective session, were there any other takeaways from your interviews of ways that we can be more proactive with stress management?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of kind of, one of the things that's kind of really underrated is just self-care. One of the things that we talked a lot about in these interviews was self-care and self-compassion.
What do you mean by self-care? Give me some examples of what
so self-care means. Self-care, for example, is just doing what you want to do. You know, I've had a crap day at work and I want a glass of wine. That's fine. I've had I'm feeling really awful, and so I really want to go home and play on the Xbox or play on the PlayStation, whatever your console of choice is. That's okay. And it's making sure you've got that healthy balance between the two. The self-compassion element of this comes into just saying to yourself what you would say to other people. So
what about though when that self-care glass of wine then turns into 3 to 4 to 5, right, in terms of thinking, well, I'm going to give myself permission to do that, and then we're suddenly opening up another box of frogs that are going to be leaping around?
Total box of frogs. And you're right. And then one of the things we need to be really consciously aware of is dependency and essentially addiction, because again, alcoholism and addiction and all that kind of stuff drives really bad behavior. It drives really bad physical health. And again, bad physical health means bad mental health. It's just a fact. And one of the things that we find is that when you can kind of go, do you know what, I've had a rubbish day at work, so I'm going to have a glass of wine when I get home, that's okay, because you've kind of gone cause effect. But actually, when we have to kind of be very aware that actually this one bad day at work was caused by X, Y, and Z. These were the 3 things that caused it. This is just it's a sticking plaster. That's all it is. It's a sticking plaster. It's some aloe vera on a wound, on a burn. That's all it is. But when this happens day in, day out, every day, and every single day, you need this. We can't just deal with this. We can't just keep putting a sticking plaster on it. You know, you can't keep running your fingers over the blade of a pair of scissors and going, oh God, I'm getting cut. That's the difference. Is you can have a little bit of self-care. You can have a little bit of this kind of, yeah, I want a glass of wine. I want to eat a chocolate donut, whatever. But you need to deal with the core, the actual fundamental basic issue. As if you don't, this becomes a coping mechanism, and this will drive bigger problems. Mm-hmm. So yes, every now and then say, yeah, do you know what? It's Friday, and so Friday night is burger night. Every Friday night we'll have a burger because we've earned it. Fine, do your thing, go for your life. But actually, if you are finding that that is a necessity, that you need that in order to get yourself through the week. So what would happen if this disappeared? Then you've got a problem. Mm-hmm. Because without dealing with the actual basic fundamental problem, no amount of this will ever help.
That really, really crucial point there you're making there. And it's this habit loop of, I'm going to do this because I deserve it, because of the adversity or resilience that I've shown in stress. But the real question is why am I reaching for this dependency hook or this treat or this reward to justify the negativity that I'm feeling? If you fail to address that wound, like you said before with the analogy of your finger becoming septic, gangrenous, falling off, the consequences are hugely significant. And the bit that I'm taking away from this conversation that I'm very, very curious about is how to give time and space to perspective, and having the ability to say to yourself, just stop a minute and think, why are you feeling this way? Because when you're stressed, it's this flywheel that just goes faster and faster and faster. But how do we retrospectively look from up on high and go, oh my goodness, Paddy, you are just killing yourself with what you're doing?
Yeah.
How do they do that? How do they take this helicopter view of themselves when they're just busy nose to the ground?
Oh, totally. You're absolutely right, because it's a really hard thing to do. It's really hard, and I don't think we do anyone any favors by saying it's easy and it's simple and just do X, Y, and Z and life gets better, because it's just not true. But the thing to do is, like you say, having this self-awareness. And the self-awareness for me, the thing that works for me, is journaling. Now, when we talk about doing the journal, most people think, dear diary, today I did X, Y, and Z and this, that, and the other, and whatever. It doesn't have to be like that. And I'll give you an example. When we think about journaling, one of the things I encourage other people to do is consider the 4 learning techniques. So the 4 learning techniques are visual, auditory, reading and writing, and kinesthetic. So basically, when you are learning something, would you rather look at a picture or a video? Would you rather talk about it, or listen about it? Would you rather read or write about it? Or would you rather do something? And everybody favors one over the other. There's a mixture. There's definitely a mixture of them, but everyone has one dominant one. What you do is you leverage that. So there's a girl I work with who is one of the young people I work with, and I was talking to her about journaling, and we went through this process, and I said, you need to figure out, what is it? What's the thing that's going to help you? Frankly, it's a genius solution. She came back about a week later and said, I've been journaling. I was like, brilliant. I can't show you it though. I said, you don't have to show it to me. This is personal to you. This is private. Said, no, I can't show it to you because it doesn't exist. Because what I do is I wake up every morning and I've always got a song stuck in my head. Always have a song stuck in her head. I was like, okay, fair enough. And she said, what I do is during the day, I change the lyrics to the song. So suddenly it's like, and then I went to school and someone shouted at me on the bus. And so by the end of the day, she's got a song of her day, because she's a very auditory person. She likes music, she likes listening to things. She hates writing, she hates reading, she hates drawing. Couldn't think of anything worse than all of those things, but that's her way. And suddenly, by going through that process of journaling, what you do is you break down your day and you give your mind the ability to compartmentalize things, to file stuff away and go, okay, this goes into the file of rubbish day. This goes into the file of stuff that makes me anxious or whatever. And you notice all these things. And what's quite helpful, if you write, for example, so some people, like I said, will draw a picture of their day. Keep it, hold on to it, and then you can go back and compare it. So I've been keeping journals for a few years now, and only this year my partner and I realized that actually every February, in the second half of February, I take a dip. My depression gets worse. Every single year, without fail. It basically comes like the 13th, 14th, 15th of February, I have a dip, and I just feel awful. So next year, we're going on holiday in February. We've decided we're going to book a holiday for the end of February, so that when I'm having that dip, I've actually got something to look forward to instead of dreading it. And when you start recognizing those patterns, that's when you can start doing something about it.
I'm mindful of teachers working with children, and they ask them to draw a picture of how they're feeling, and sometimes they're looking for the clues of the child in the playground crying because they're on their own, as to what signals that give. I love that VARC mechanism there of the 4 learning styles. And on journaling, I also think it's, if I can give my own thoughts, is that people are generally encouraged to write a positive journal experience about their day. And actually, I think it needs to be a truthful one. And when you've had a negative day, to write those thoughts down and then read out what you can do to try to preempt that negativity, because every failure is a learning. And if we only have a journal that's focused on positives, actually it's perhaps not it's a superficial view of our day. So I'll quite happily write sometimes I've had a crap day today. The reason was because I got rejected on the phone, or my speech wasn't very good, or I wasn't particularly lucid on some of my conversations. And what am I going to do as a result of that? So that's why journaling, I think, works for me. Anything else by way of self-care or other methodologies to try to eliminate this stress? What about chemicals, prescription drugs, that kind of stuff to overcome it? What's your thoughts on that?
So there's this general thought process around everything that prescription medication is a bad thing. And I have a very specific view on this, which is that it's a good thing. I have been taking antidepressants now for about 8 years, 7 or 8 years or something like that. And honestly, I couldn't exist the way I do without them. Whether that means I've become dependent on them or whatever, it doesn't, that's a conversation between me and my doctor. But I can't, but they level me to a position where I can do something, where I can accept treatment. We have this balance between medication and talking therapies, and sometimes talking therapies is enough. But for some people, you need the medication to be able to carry it, to be able to put your mind in a position that you can help, that you can accept these things. And there's all sorts of stuff. There's stuff that will help you just level you off. There's antipsychotics that for people who are experiencing things like psychosis and schizophrenia that are really important. But then there's also things like Valium or diazepam, which is essentially it's a tranquilizer. Don't quote me on this, obviously, but it's essentially a tranquilizer. And I think there's this general view around they're a bad thing because because if you need Prozac, then there's clearly something wrong with you and you're dangerous or whatever. But actually, it's just not the case. Medication is there to do a very, very important job. And it's, for some people, you just need it for a few weeks and then you just to help deal with that moment. But for other people, it's a much more long-term thing. I would encourage anyone who is experiencing these problems, particularly long-term, to speak to their doctor about it, because actually doctors very much try to resist putting people onto antidepressants and things like that. It's a very much a last. It's a last resort. I did a speech about my mental health problems a few months ago, maybe a year or so ago, and I went through and I actually went back through my medical records to find the first moment that I had spoken to my doctor about my anxiety and depression, to the point at which they had prescribed me fluoxetine, and it was 23 months, that's due diligence to the greatest effect. And during that time we tried all sorts of other things, all sorts of talking therapies and different techniques and mindfulness and books and podcasts and all sorts of stuff, and nothing really seemed to land. Taking medication was the thing that turned the corner for me. That was the thing that made me able to accept talking therapies as a way of solving it. And like I say, at this point in time, I have been on and off them various points over the past few years. But at this point in time, without them, I don't think that I would be in the position I am today.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the honest share there. And I'm really getting a sense of it's what works for you individually, not as in you, Paddy, but you as in a societal norm, as to don't be inclined that you have to sit in the box, which is talking therapies or self-care or mindfulness or journaling, but be curious enough to find what could work for you and then consistently try to commit to that as a coping strategy or as a way out. I guess the big point here, though, Paddy, is we had Stress Awareness Month in April. How do we continue to make it something that is top of mind for industries not just associated with logistics and not just associated with men that are in midlife and coping with adversity? How do we continue to make it a conversation that is part of everyday conversation?
It's the same as most of these things. It's not. We mustn't think that we mustn't kind of fall into the trap of thinking that it's only global thinking. Think local. You know, if you're feeling like these things, talk about them. That doesn't mean to say that you need to get it put on a t-shirt, walking around going, I'm having a bad day, I am very stressed today. But everyone has trusted friends, everyone has people they feel like they can talk to. And when you start to open up, if you take the first step and you start talking about these things and you start asking with genuine sincerity about other people, you know, not just asking, oh, how are you? No, like we started our conversation at the beginning of this. Well, how are you? I'm fine. Right. If you start asking that with genuine sincerity, then that makes a big difference. And if you start having these conversations with people, you know, with other people and saying, do you know what, I'm having a bad day and this is the reason, or I'm having a bad day, I don't really know why, I just, you know, I could just do with a bit of compassion today. That is the way to do it, because fundamentally big things like Stress Awareness Month don't change anything unless they are taken up at grassroots level. It's always the same. It's always the same, irrelevant of what we're trying to achieve. If you don't get the buy-in from people at all levels, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
Beautiful. Could you just end us with perhaps a story of where you found somebody who was struggling and through some of your intervention, you've enabled them to live a life of more freedom, joy, fulfillment?
Yeah. I mean, I was working for a business not too far from where I currently live, and I'm not going to say who it was because you know. And I was working with the guy. I was his planner, and he really wanted to be a driver, really wanted to be a driver, and he paid for his own license, which is not a small sum of money. And he joined my fleet. He joined my team, and he'd gone off with his trainer. So he was with his trainer. So he passed his license, and within a week, he was behind the wheel of one of our wagons with a trainer, learning to drive what we did. And 6 days into that, so this guy was ex-forces, used to be, I believe, in the army, so really used to high pressure environments. And he came to my desk one day and said, I quit. I'm not doing it. I'm not, you know, a weekend, I'm not doing it anymore. I can't do it. And I was like, okay, that's strange, given all things considered. Let's talk about it. You know, I'm not going to try and talk you out of it. If you've decided this is not for you, fine. I'm not going to try and talk you out of it. I just want to make sure you understand that we're all on the same page and there's nothing I can do. And essentially what had happened was that the guy had been absolutely ripped to shreds by his trainer. Also ex-forces, I think he was in signals. And his trainer was just being thoroughly unreasonable. And so we talked about it for a while, and I sort of managed to talk him out of quitting, because we swapped his trainer, because I realized at this point the damage is already done. There's no way in heck that we're going to be able to fix your relationship with this other guy. And once we had done that, and we kind of taken the time to really work on, because at this point a lot of it had become quite traumatic for him, coming up to specific roundabouts or changing specific sites that we were dealing with was becoming really difficult for him. And so we ended up sort of doing big piece around mindfulness, being a really big piece around this awareness of his anxiety that had just generated essentially overnight because of his work with this one individual. We really sort of started to boil down actually the way he was feeling and how that interacted with his emotions. So how his physical sensations around the knock at the back of the lorry, or the way that his chest felt tight, and how that actually interacted. And once we kind of understood that, actually, once he kind of understood actually the way that tightness, how that was just a result of the muscles tightening due to a shot of adrenaline, he really started to make a big turn. And I think he's still with the business, now, and doing really, really well. But like I say, without understanding exactly what had caused the problem and all these physical sensations he was going through, he would have stopped. Absolutely.
Well, good that you managed to find a time to ask, hey, I'm curious, why are you feeling this way, considering that should be a moment of euphoria? You've been training for this, you've got your license, 6 days behind the wheel, and yet it's not quite the outcome that you would have expected from your perspective. Where can we find you, Paddy, to engage more about these conversations? What's the best way to find you?
Yeah, so you can get me, I've got my website, which is MacBrant.co.uk. You can find all my contact details on there, or you can find me on LinkedIn at Paddy MacBrant. I'm the only one. The
only Paddy MacBrant?
I hope so.
Well, there is only one Chris Wilson sitting in this chair from an A perspective, but there are many, many Chris Wilsons that exist in the world. Could you just leave us with one key takeaway today that you would like people to reflect on to enable them to live a more stress-free life going forward?
Yeah, my one takeaway that I say to every single person is, when you are feeling like that, and you've identified that you're feeling like that, is just being compassionate to yourself. Is when you feel anxious or stressed or whatever, the first thing to say to yourself is, that's okay. I'm allowed to feel like this. And from there, you start from a place of compassion and inner joy and inner love. Everything else flows.
A lovely way to finish. Paddy MacBrant, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
And for those listening, remember, today's conversation reminds us we do only have one life. So live life, living life.